We've been talking in this unit about the Renaissance and the Reformation. The final section in this unit deals with a very important part of this time period, that being the scientific revolution. Our objectives for this lecture: explain how new discoveries in astronomy changed the way people view their universe and the world around them. Understand the new scientific method and how it developed. Finally, we will analyze the contributions that Newton and other scientists made to the scientific revolution. Our focus question: how did discoveries in science lead to a new way of thinking for Europeans? We talked about the Renaissance representing a rebirth. And with the scientific revolution, we truly see that break from the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the medieval past, and a new way of scientific thinking. At the heart of that revolution is this understanding that mathematical laws govern nature and also the universe. It follows then that people can know, manage, and shape the physical world. And this is a dramatic shift in understanding from earlier times. Until the mid-1500s, the European view of the universe had been the theories of Ptolemy and Aristotle from 1,000 years before. And in those theories, it was believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. In 1543, the Polish astronomer Copernicus published On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, in which he challenged this view. Copernicus believed that it was a sun-centered model, or heliocentric, that these heavenly bodies revolved around the sun, not around the Earth. The Earth was just one of any number of planets that revolved around the sun. Well, Copernicus' theory was revolutionary, and it was almost universally rejected. The idea is that if we could question the theories of Ptolemy and other classic scholars, then my goodness, all human knowledge might be called into question. And many people were very uncomfortable with this possibility. In the late 1500s, a Danish astronomer, Tycho Brahe, provided evidence that supported Copernicus' heliocentric theory. Now, Brahe set up his own observatory and observed the sky, accumulating data over a number of years of the movement of these heavenly bodies. After his death, his work was continued by his assistant, Johann Kepler, who worked to calculate the orbits of the planets. Now, Kepler's data supported Copernicus' theory of a heliocentric view, but at the same time, he also learned that the planets don't move in perfect circles. Rather, they have an oval-shaped orbit called an ellipse. Now, scientists in different countries built upon the foundations laid by Copernicus and Kepler. In Italy, Galileo Galilei built a telescope and he observed the 4 moons that orbit around Jupiter. He realized that these movements were exactly the same as those of the planets around the sun. Now, Galileo's discoveries caused an uproar. Scholars attacked him because his observations contradicted the ancient view that the Earth was the center of the universe. In 1633, Galileo was tried before the Inquisition. And we've talked about the Inquisition before, not just for religious matters and beliefs, but in this case also it dealt with science. And for the rest of his life, he was kept under house arrest. Eventually he was threatened with death unless he withdrew his heresies, as they were called, and agreed to state publicly in court that the Earth stood motionless at the center of the universe. Despite opposition from the church, which at this point kind of felt that these new developments and anything new would be a challenge to them and their power, a new approach to science emerged in the early 1600s. Scientists went back and looked again at the work of the Greek philosopher Plato, who looked at mathematics as a key to understanding and learning about the universe. Two men, the Englishman Francis Bacon and the Frenchman René Descartes, challenged the thought that medieval scholarship had to be consistent and fit within the teachings of the Church. Both Bacon and Descartes argued that the truth isn't known at the beginning of your process, but rather at the end. They differed, however, into how you got to that end. Francis Bacon stressed that observation and experimentation will lead you to the truth at the end of your inquiry. He wanted science to be practical, to result in things that are useful in people's lives. Descartes' approach was a little bit different. He emphasized that human reasoning or logic was the best road to understanding. And we've talked a little bit about this before in talking about reconciling reason and logic with faith. Now, Descartes can be a little bit difficult to understand, but for purposes of this lecture, let's just talk a little bit about it at a higher level. In his work, Discourse on Method, Descartes explains how he decided to discard all the traditional authorities in his search for what knowledge is provable. And in his mind, the only thing he could not question was his doubt. And he concluded that doubt was the only thing he could not question, and that in order to doubt, he had to exist as a rational, thinking being. Therefore, we come up with his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." Over time, there developed a step-by-step scientific method that was utilized, and it required the collection of data and a proposal for a hypothesis to be tested using that data. And here we see a diagram of that process. First, in step 1, we state the problem. In step 2, we gather and collect information on the problem. Step 3, we form a hypothesis or some sort of educated guess as to what is occurring. In step 4, we test that hypothesis with experimentation. Again, in step 5, we collect data and analyze that data, and in step 6, we draw some conclusions. And then another very important step is step 7, where we communicate and share that data so that others can understand and perhaps test further. So it continues back in the circle, back to step 1, and in this way, the process gets refined. It's important to mention that this scientific method is used even to the current day, and many of the advancements that are made in the approaches to research follow this basic scientific method. Also, in this scientific revolution, we saw amazing advances in medical knowledge in the 1500s and 1600s. The Frenchman Andreas Vesalius published his work on the structure of the human body in 1543, and this was the first really accurate, detailed study of the human anatomy. Now, Vesalius tried to avail himself of every opportunity that he could to observe the actual human body, whether this was being a witness to autopsies done, or in his case, he would arrange to do autopsies himself. And in this case, since it was generally not accepted practice for someone to do this, he would do it hoping that the authorities would look the other way. Another pioneering scientist, this time a Dutchman, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, perfected the microscope and became the first person to see these cells and microorganisms in isolation using this microscope. The Englishman William Harvey was the first to describe how blood circulates throughout the body, showing that the heart was a pump pumping blood through veins and arteries. And then finally we have the Frenchman Ambroise Paré, who developed new techniques of surgery, new tools, artificial limbs, and even ointments that helped prevent infections. So you can see with these scientific and medical advancements how these opened the doors for future scientists and future discoveries to be made, and it truly was a different approach to the process. In this time of the scientific revolution, we also saw advancements in terms of chemistry. Now, in medieval times, these people who called themselves alchemists believed that they could transform any substance into another kind of substance, and more specifically, they believed that they could transform any kind of metal into gold. In the scientific revolution, these experiments of the alchemists were abandoned. But some of their practices, especially the manipulation of metals and acids, set the stage for what we know today as modern chemistry. One, an Englishman, Robert Boyle, refined the idea of chemicals as basic building blocks. He explained that all matter was composed of tiny particles that behave in ways that we can know and understand. He also defined the difference between what we know today as individual elements and chemical compounds. And finally, he was the first to explain the effect or the impact of temperature and pressure on gases and how they behave. This opened the door for modern chemical analysis and the composition of an understanding of the composition of matter. Isaac Newton was the first to link science and mathematics. Newton's theory was that gravity was the force that controls the basic movement of the planets. He believed that the motion of the universe can be measured and described in mathematical terms. Newton's work and his laws of motion and mechanics have practical uses and also contributed to the development of calculus, something with which many of you are already familiar. Okay, let's move on to our terms and people by way of review. Nicholas Copernicus, Polish astronomer who proposed a heliocentric model of the universe, where the planets revolve around the sun, not around the earth. And here's heliocentric, the idea that the sun, not the earth, is the center of the universe. Tycho Brahe, the astronomer who worked over years to collect data to prove that Copernicus was correct in his theories and his belief. His work was continued by Kepler, who plotted the orbits and determined that planets move in an elliptical orbit, not a round orbit. Galileo, the scientist who proved that the Earth moves around the sun. In 1633, the Inquisition forced him reluctantly to recant his views of a heliocentric universe. Francis Bacon rejected the assumptions of Aristotle and viewed scientific goal as improving technology, not supporting the Bible. Very revolutionary and transformational during this time period. René Descartes proposed the need to search for provable knowledge. The only assumption he could make was that he could not question doubt itself. Scientific method, a step-by-step process of discovery that requires the collection, the measuring, and then the communicating of data and findings. Hypothesis, the logical or possible explanation to a problem that is tested then using the scientific method. Robert Boyle, who described matter as being composed of tiny particles that behave in understandable ways. He also proposed laws that govern gases and the impact on gases of temperature and pressure. Isaac Newton, who argued that there are uniform laws of nature and that motions can be measured using mathematics. Gravity, proposed by Newton as the force that not only keeps control of things here on Earth, but also that keeps planets in orbit. And calculus, a branch of mathematics that is an extension of the work of Newton. This concludes our lecture on Section 5 of Chapter 13, and I'll refer you back to the focus question: how did discoveries in science lead to a new way of thinking for Europeans?